Last week, Kiyaya and I brought you into the bizarre world of James Henry Trotter, whose parents died gruesomely in a rhinoceros attack. He goes off to live with his two evil aunts up on a mountaintop and meets an unusual fellow who gives him a very special gift. However, things didn't turn out for James the way he thought they would, and a magical peach starts to grow on a barren peach tree. What do you think's gonna happen, Kiyaya? Let's find out. It's time to get cozy. Sit back and relax. It's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel.
David Axterby of Long Island Telecom. We are your cellular superstore. We have the best in no-contract cellular on every carrier in the United States. We also do portable MiFi units, home phone service. We could beat your cable company at their own game by providing you very inexpensive TV, and we are a Sirius XM dealer as well. We can create a website for you, give you a special corporate email, and we do credit card processing. 631-833-9679.
Stories are such an important part of our lives. Join my friend Kiyaya and I for Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel, where we share some of the greatest picture books and chapters from children's and young adult literature to inspire you to keep embedding literacy into your days. Chapter 7. The two women and the small boy stood absolutely still on the grass underneath the tree, gazing up at this extraordinary fruit. James's little face was glowing with excitement. His eyes were as big and bright as two stars. He could see the peach swelling larger and larger, as clearly as if it were a balloon being blown up. In half a minute, it was the size of a melon. In another half minute, it was twice as big again. "Just look at it growing!" Aunt Spiker cried. "Will it ever stop?" Aunt Sponge shouted, waving her fat arms and starting to dance around in circles. And now it was so big, it looked like an enormous butter-colored pumpkin dangling from the top of the tree. "Get away from that tree trunk, you stupid boy!" Aunt Spiker yelled. "The slightest shake and I'm sure it will fall off. It must weigh 20 or 30 pounds, at least." The branch that peach was growing upon was beginning to bend over further and further because of the weight. "Stand back!" Aunt Sponge shouted. "It's coming down! The branch is going to break!" But the branch didn't break. It simply bent over more and more as that peach got heavier. And still it went on growing. In another minute, this mammoth fruit was as large and round and fat as Aunt Sponge herself, and probably just as heavy. "It has to stop now," Aunt Spiker yelled. "It can't go on forever." But it didn't stop. Soon it was the size of a small car and reached halfway to the ground. Both aunts were now hopping around and around the tree, clapping their hands and shouting all sorts of silly things in their excitement. "Hallelujah!" Aunt Spiker shouted. "What a peach! What a peach!" "Terrifico!" Aunt Sponge cried out. "Magnifico! Splendifico! And what a meal!" It was still growing. I know. As for James, he was so spellbound by the whole thing that he could only stand and stare and murmur quietly to himself, "Oh, isn't it beautiful? It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Shut up, you little twerp," Aunt Spiker snapped, happening to overhear him. "It's none of your business." That's right, Aunt Sponge declared. It's got nothing to do with you whatsoever. Keep out of it. Look, Aunt Spiker shouted, it's growing faster than ever now. It's speeding up. I see it, Spiker. I do. Bigger and bigger, the peach grew. Bigger and bigger and bigger. Then at last, when it had become nearly as tall as the tree that it was growing on, as tall and wide as a small house, the bottom part of it gently touched the ground. And there it rested. It can't fall off now, Aunt Sponge shouted. It stopped growing, Aunt Spiker cried. No, it hasn't. Yes, it has. It's slowing down, Spiker. It's slowing down, but it hasn't stopped yet. Just watch. There was a pause. It has now. I believe you're right. Do you think it's safe to touch it? I don't know. We'd better be careful. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker began walking slowly around the peach, inspecting it very cautiously from all sides. They were like a couple of hunters who had just shot an elephant and were not quite sure whether it was dead or alive. And the massive round fruit towered over them so high that they looked like midgets from another world beside it. The skin of the peach was very beautiful, a rich buttery yellow with patches of brilliant pink and red. Aunt Sponge advanced cautiously and touched it with the tip of one finger. It's ripe, she cried. It's just perfect. Now see here, Spiker, why don't we go get a shovel right away and dig out a great big hunk of it for me and you to eat? No, Aunt Spiker said, not yet. Why ever not? Because I say so. But I can't wait to eat some, Aunt Sponge cried out. She was watering at the mouth now, and a thin trickle of spit was running down one side of her chin. My dear Sponge, Aunt Spiker said slowly, winking at her sister and smiling a sly, thin-lipped smile. There's a pile of money to be made out of this if only we can handle it right. You wait and see. Chapter 8. The news that a peach almost as big as a house had suddenly appeared in someone's garden spread like wildfire across the countryside, and the next day a stream of people came scrambling up the steep hill to gaze upon this marvel. Quickly, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker called in carpenters and had them build a strong fence around the peach to save it from the crowd. And at the same time, these two crafty women stationed themselves at the front gate with a large bunch of tickets and started charging everyone for coming in. Roll up, Aunt Spiker yelled. Only 1 shilling to see the giant peach. Half price for children under 6 weeks old, Aunt Sponge shouted. One at a time, please. Don't push. Don't push. You're all going to get in. Hey, you! Come back there. You haven't paid. By lunchtime, the whole place was a seething mass of men, women, and children, all pushing and shoving to get a glimpse of this miraculous fruit. Helicopters were landing like wasps all over the hill, and out of them poured swarms of newspaper reporters, cameramen, and men from the television companies. It'll cost you double to bring in a camera, Aunt Spiker shouted. All right, they answered. We don't care. And the money came rolling into the pockets of the two greedy ants. But while all this excitement was going on outside, poor James was forced to stay locked in his bedroom, peeping through the bars of his window at the crowds below. The disgusting little brute will only get in everyone's way if we let him wander about, Aunt Spiker had said early that morning. Oh, please, he begged. I haven't met any other children for years and years, and there are going to be lots of them down there for me to play with. And perhaps I can help you with the tickets. Cut it out, Aunt Sponge had snapped. Your Aunt Spiker and I are about to become millionaires, and the last thing we want is the likes of you messing things up and getting in the way. Later, when the evening of the first day came and the people had all gone home, the ants unlocked James's door and ordered him to go outside and pick up all the banana skins and orange peel bits and bits of paper that the crowd had left behind. "Could I please have something to eat first?" he asked. "I haven't had a thing all day." "No," they shouted, kicking him out the door. "We're too busy to make food. We're counting our money." "But it's dark!" cried James. "Get out!" they yelled, "and stay out until you've cleaned up all the mess." The door slammed. The key turned in the lock. Hungry and trembling, James stood alone out in the open, wondering what to do. The night was all around him now, and overhead a wild white moon was riding in the sky. There was not a sound, not a movement anywhere. Most people, and especially small children, are often quite scared of being out of doors alone in the moonlight. Everything is so deadly quiet, and the shadows are so long and black, and they keep turning into strange shapes that seem to move as you look at them. And then the slightest little snap of a twig makes you jump. James felt exactly like that now. He stared straight ahead with large, frightened eyes. Hardly daring to breathe, not far away, in the middle of the garden, he could see the giant peach towering over everything else. Surely it was even bigger than before. And what a dazzling sight it was! The moonlight was shining and glinting on its great curving sides, turning them to crystal and silver. It looked like a tremendous silver ball lying there in the grass, silent, mysterious, and wonderful. And then, all at once, little shivers of excitement started running over the skin on James's back. Something else, he told himself, something stranger than ever this time is about to happen to me again soon. He was sure of it. He could feel it coming. He looked around him, wondering what on earth it was going to be. The garden lay soft and silver in the moonlight. The grass was wet with dew, and a million dewdrops were sparkling and twinkling like diamonds around his feet. And now suddenly, the whole place, the whole garden, seemed to be alive with magic. Almost without knowing what he was doing, as though drawn by some powerful magnet, James Henry Trotter started walking slowly toward the giant peach. He climbed over the fence that surrounded it and stood directly beneath it, staring up at its great, bulging sides. He put out a hand and touched it gently with the tip of one of his fingers. It felt soft and warm and slightly furry, like the skin of a baby mouse. He moved a step closer and rubbed his cheek lightly against it. And then suddenly, while he was doing this, he happened to notice that right beside him and below him, close to the ground, there was a hole in the side of the peach. Chapter 10. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders in. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't just a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was the curious, bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight toward the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made from wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. "Good heavens," he said, "I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach." Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look, who's here?" And another one said, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and stared at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back to the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown wall behind him. Chapter 11. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures. Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog? You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog, sitting on a stool directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider, there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in curled-up positions, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention to it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring hard at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper said. "So am I," the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everyone's famished," he said. "We need food." 4 pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa. But he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright, and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the old green grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing," the ladybug cried. "I do believe he thinks it's him we are wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all sides. "Oh dear," they said. "What an awful thought!" "You mustn't be frightened," the ladybug said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat. We've been waiting for you all day long," the old green grasshopper said. "We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it." "So cheer up, my boy, cheer up," the centipede said. And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all off myself. Chapter 12. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable, so he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and he knelt down beside him. "Thank you so much," the centipede said. "You are very kind." "You have a lot of boots," James murmured. "I have a lot of legs," the centipede answered proudly, "and a lot of feet. 100, to be exact." "There he goes again," the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. "He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyway, there's nothing marvelous, you know, centipede, about having a lot of legs." "Poor fellow," the centipede said, whispering in James's ears. "He's blind." "He can't see how splendid I look." "In my opinion," the earthworm said, "the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and to be able to walk just the same." "You call that walking?" cried the centipede. "You're a slitherer. And that's all you are. You just slither along." "I glide," said the earthworm primly. "You are a slimy beast," answered the centipede. "I am not a slimy beast," the earthworm said. "I am a useful and much-loved creature. Ask any gardener you like, and as for you, I'm a pest," the centipede announced, grinning broadly and as he looked around the room for approval. "He is so proud of that," said the ladybug, smiling at James. "Though for the life of me I cannot understand why." "I am the only pest in this room," cried the centipede, still grinning away, "unless you count old green grasshopper over here. But he is long past it now. He's too old to be a pest anymore." The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice, "I have never been a pest in all my life. I'm a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybug. "James," the centipede said, "your name is James, isn't it?" "Yes." "Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous colossal centipede as me?" "I certainly haven't," James answered. "How on earth did you get to be like that?" "Very peculiar, said the centipede. "Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden under the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose. Bright green it was, and extraordinarily beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stone or crystal." "Oh, but I know what that was," cried James. "It happened to me too," said the ladybug. "And me," Miss Spider said. "Suddenly there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them." "I actually swallowed one," the earthworm declared proudly. "So did I," said the ladybug. "I swallowed 3, the centipede cried. "But who's telling the story anyway? Don't interrupt." "It's too late to tell stories now," the old green grasshopper announced. "It's time to go to sleep." "I refuse to sleep in my boots," the centipede cried. "How many more are there to come off, James?" "I think I've done about 20 so far," James told him. "Then that leaves 80 to go," the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. "He's lying again." The centipede roared with laughter. "Stop pulling the earthworm's leg," the ladybug said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. "Pulling his leg," he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. "Which leg am I pulling now? You tell me!" James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing aloud in all the time he had been with them. "We really must get some sleep," the old green grasshopper said. "We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow. So So would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds? Chapter 13. A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so it actually looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable," Miss Spider said to the old green grasshopper. "I made it as soft and silky as I possibly could. I spun it with gossamer. That's a much better quality thread than the one I use for my own web." "Thank you so much, my dear lady," the old green grasshopper said, climbing up into the hammock. "Ah, this is just what I needed. Good night, everyone. Good night." Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and the ladybug got in. After that, she spun a long one for the centipede and an even longer one for the earthworm. "And how do you like your bed?" she said to James when it came his turn. "Hard or soft?" "I like it soft, thank you very much," James answered. "For goodness sake, stop staring round the room and get on with my boots," the centipede said. "You and I are never going to get any sleep at this rate. And kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder." James worked frantically on the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off, and to make matters worse, all the laces were tied in the most complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours. And by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all, and had lined them up in a row on the floor, 21 pairs altogether, the centipede was fast asleep. "Wake up, centipede," whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. "It's time for bed." "Thank you, my dear child," the centipede said, opening his eyes. Then he got down off the sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into his hammock. James got into his own hammock, and oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared with the hard bare boards his aunts had always made him sleep upon at home. "Lights out," said the centipede drowsily. Nothing happened. "Turn out the light," he called, raising his voice. James glanced around the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybug was making whistling noise as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at the one end of his hammock, wheezing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the very center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. "I said turn out the light!" shouted the centipede angrily. "Are you talking to me?" James asked. "Of course I'm not talking to you, you ass," the centipede answered. "That crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on." For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he was. He saw an extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a gigantic fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long, was standing upside down upon its 6 legs in the middle of the ceiling, and the tail end of this creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. "Is that a glowworm?" asked James, staring at the light. "It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to me." "Of course it's a glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that's what she calls herself. Although actually you are quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They are simply lady fireflies without wings. Wake up, you lazy beast!" But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked up one of his boots from the floor. "Put out that wretched light," he shouted, hurling the boot up at the ceiling. The glowworm softly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. "There's no need to be rude," she said coldly. "All in good time." "Come on, come on, come on," shouted the centipede, "or I'll put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," the glowworm said, looking down and giving James a little wave and a smile. I didn't see you come in. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome. And good night. Then click. Out went the light. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went on between them. "Good night, old green grasshopper," he whispered. "Good night, ladybug. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he can go through all of them, he had fallen fast asleep. This is quite an adventure James Trotter is going through as he ventures inside that giant peach. I know, it's incredible. Large insects that can talk. Friends, we're going to give you an opportunity to do something that we very often don't do when we share chapter books with each other. Kiyaya and I have now come to the favorite part of our show. That's right, Kiyaya. Let's get crafty. Roald Dahl paints such amazing illustrations of what these insects and what this peach looks like. Draw a picture or do a painting of which insect or the peach that you like the most. Share your art with us on our social media at Stitching Wolf on Facebook and Instagram, or send them to us through email. Get cozy at STITCHINGwolfDesigns.com. Until we meet again, stay happy, safe, and healthy, and always remember, that's right, Kiyaya, reading is power.